Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this is my co-host, Gingersnap. So welcome back to our living room for our Tuesday night Bible study series. So earlier at the end of the summer and through the fall, we were looking at the books that didn't make it into the whole Old Testament or that are disputed with between Catholic and Protestant Bibles, the deuterocanonical or apocryphal books. So now I wanted to look at some of the Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, and they are really, really interesting. And they have just this great tradition of people trying to figure out who Jesus was at his essence and how he worked as a human but divine. And anyway, so today we're going to read a couple sections from two different Gospels, the Gospel of James and the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. So the Gospel of James is quite early. The issue is not when it was written or even who it was written by or where it was written or whatever. So it's a 2nd or 3rd century. Whereas the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew was written sometime between the 7th century and the 9th century, or it was written in pieces, or it looked like there was some scholarly disagreement there. So, Pseudo-Matthew. Why Pseudo-Matthew? It's not that Matthew, basically, is why we're clarifying. We would use pseudo kind of to mean fake in our English today. But it used to be that if you were writing in the tradition of somebody, then you would be a pseudo-Matthew or a pseudo-Origen or a pseudo-Augustine. And so because you've been trained in that school of thought, you use that name. Today, we would call that plagiarism, and it would not be good, but they didn't really have the same concept. Well, they didn't really have a concept of plagiarism back then, so it's an interesting tradition. So the author is probably not anyone named Matthew, but is someone who, maybe is a line of people who were particular followers of Matthew or cat furs, knew him. Anyway, just an interesting thing there. So, I wanted to read from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. Let us begin. In those days, there was a man in Jerusalem, Joachim by name, of the tribe of Judah. He was the shepherd of his own sheep, fearing the Lord in integrity and singleness of heart. He had no other care than that of his herds. Therefore his lambs and his sheep and his wool and all things whatsoever he possessed, he used to divide into 3 portions. 1 he gave to the orphans, the widows, the strangers, and the poor. The 2nd to those that worshipped God. And the 3rd he kept for himself and all his house. And as he did so, the Lord multiplied to him his herds, so that there was no man like him in the people of Israel. This now he began to do when he was 15 years old. And at the age of 20 he took to wife Anna, the daughter of Achar, of his own tribe, that is, of the tribe of Judah, of the family of David. And though they had lived together for 20 years, he had by her neither sons nor daughters. So this is kind of trying to call to mind some earlier stories in the Bible, Hannah conceiving Samuel, Abraham and Sarah, people who've, feel like they are much past their childbearing years, but a miracle happens anyway. Although I think it's odd here, maybe I'm projecting as someone who hit 33 this year. 40 is not old, right? 40's not old. I don't know exactly how old Anna is, but I don't think she's that old either. So anyway. So 2nd chapter. And it happened that, in the time of the feast, among those who were offering incense to the Lord, Joachim stood getting ready his gifts in the sight of the Lord. And the priest, Reuben by name, coming to him, said, "It is not lawful for thee to stand among those who are doing sacrifice to God, because God has not blessed thee so as to give thee seed in Israel." Obviously, this is an older translation to be found in the public domain, hence the these and thous and odd grammar. I don't like this priest. Joachim is not good enough to be first in line to make his offerings to God because he doesn't have children. People are fully valid human beings and beloved in the eyes of God, whether or not they have or are able to have children. But that, anyway. Obviously, in the 21st century, we have a very, very fundamentally different idea of how babies are made than they would have when these books were written. Anyway, so being therefore put to shame in the sight of the people, yeah, that would be embarrassing. Joachim retired from the temple of the Lord weeping, and did not return to his house, but went to his flocks, taking with him his shepherds into the mountains to a far country, so that for 5 months his wife Anna could hear no tidings of him. And she prayed with tears, saying, O Lord, most mighty God of Israel, why hast thou, seeing that already thou hast not given me children, taken from me my husband also? Behold, now 5 months that I have not seen my husband, and I know not where he is tarrying, nor, if I knew him to be dead, could I bury him. And while she wept excessively, she entered into the court of God's house, and she fell on her face in prayer, and poured out her supplications before the Lord. After this, rising from her prayer and lifting her eyes to God, she saw a sparrow's nest in a laurel tree. We had sparrows last week too. And uttered her voice to the Lord with groaning and said, Lord God Almighty, who hast given offspring to every creature, to beasts wild and tame, to serpents and birds and fishes, and they all rejoice over their young ones. Thou hast shut out me alone from the gift of thy benignity? I didn't notice that word earlier. Benignity? Okay. The 19th century had different words. For thou, O God, knowest my heart, that from the beginning of my married life I have vowed that if thou, O God, shouldst give me son or daughter, I would offer them to thee in thy holy temple. And while she was thus speaking, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared before her, saying, Be not afraid, Anna, for there is seed for thee in the decree of God, and all generations, even to the end, shall wonder at that which shall be born of thee. And when he had thus spoken, he vanished out of her sight. But she, in fear and dread, because she had seen such a sight and heard such words, at length went into her bedchamber and threw herself on the bed as if dead. And for a whole day and night she remained in great trembling and in prayer. So it seems like a slightly melodramatic response, although, I mean, flinging yourself into bed and staying there for, anyway. So angels are terrifying, which is why they usually start off with a be not afraid. But I love that phrasing is very reminiscent of another story that comes in later, when Mary gets an angel. So in this story, the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, Joachim is gone 5 months. So in the Gospel of James, Joachim is only gone 40 days and 40 nights. Which can just mean a long time. But anyway, that's an interesting difference between the two stories, which definitely have a kind of parallel storytelling. So Anna is now pregnant, and there is kind of a question of whether Mary is Joachim's biological daughter. Most of the stories would say so. There are many, many other stories about Anne and Joachim and their daughter Mary throughout the centuries. Some stories say that Mary was conceived by a kiss, which I think is kind of adorable. Meanwhile, St. Bridget, writing in the 13th or 14th century in Sweden, I think, says that Mary was conceived without sin because her parents' sexual union was free from sexual desire. I feel like St. Bridget was clearly schooled in a theological tradition that I have not been. I don't understand that, but anyway. I am not a Mariologist. I am not a Catholic. I do not come from the traditions that are very high Marian theology. Marian being the adjective of having to do with Mary, in addition to being a proper name. So anyway, now we're going to move into the Gospel of James. And look, an angel of the Lord stood nearby, saying to her, Anna, Anna, the Lord has heard your prayer. You'll conceive and give birth, and your offspring will be spoken of through the whole world. And Anna said, As the Lord God lives, whether I give birth to a boy or a girl, I'll bring it as a gift to the Lord my God, and it will minister to him all the days of its life. And look, 2 angels came, saying to her, "Look, Joachim, your husband, is coming with his flocks." For an angel of the Lord had gone down to Joachim, saying, "Joachim, Joachim, the Lord God has heard your prayer. Go down from here. Look, your wife Anna has conceived in her womb." And immediately Joachim went down and called the shepherds, saying to them, "Bring here to me 10 lambs without spot or blemish, and the 10 lambs will be for the Lord God. And bring me 12 tender calves for the priest and the elders, and 100 male goats for all the people." So he's very happy to get this news. And look, Joachim came with his flocks, and Anna stood at the gate. And she saw Joachim coming with his flocks, and immediately ran and flung herself around his neck, saying, "Now I know that the Lord God has greatly blessed me. For look, the widow is no longer a widow, and look, the one without a child in her womb has conceived." And Joachim rested for the first day in his house. It is a really lovely scene where she flings herself around his neck. It's nice. I like that part of the story. So from the next chapter, and the next day, Joachim was offering his gift, saying to himself, "If the Lord God is reconciled to me, the plate worn by the priest will make it clear to me." And Joachim offered his gifts and paid attention to the priest's plate as he went up to the altar of the Lord, and he didn't see sin in it. And Joachim said, "Now I know that the Lord God has been reconciled to me and has sent all my sins away from me." And he went down from the temple of the Lord, justified, and went into his house. So of course, the last time he was in the temple, he was kind of told he wasn't good enough, which, anyway. But now he feels sure that God is indeed with him. And about 6 months were completed, and in the 7th month she gave birth. And Anna said to her midwife, "What is it?" And the midwife said, "It's a girl." And Anna said, "My soul is magnified this day." And she laid down her child. I love that this is really bringing in echoes of Mary's story. It is Mary's story. She was just born. But Anna is saying, "My soul is magnified this day." And later Mary says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." I think that's a really lovely literary touch. And when her days were completed, Anna cleansed her menstrual flow, and she gave her breast to the child and gave her the name Mary. So now we're going to move back into the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. And having weaned Mary in her 3rd year, Joachim and Anna his wife went together to the temple of the Lord to offer sacrifices to God, and placed the infant, Mary by name. She's 3, she's not an infant, but I think this is a 19th versus 21st century language thing. Mary by name, in the community of virgins, in which the virgins remained day and night, praising God. And when she was put down before the doors of the temple, she went up the 15 steps so swiftly that she did not look back at all, nor did she, as children are wont to do, seek for her parents. Whereupon her parents, each of them anxiously seeking for the child, were both alike astonished, until they found her in the temple, and the priests of the temple themselves wondered. So that has a nice echo to the story of Jesus in the temple and his parents being confused by that. Which is a nice touch. I'm glad that Joachim agreed to Anna's promise that she would give her firstborn child to the temple of God. Would be a bit awkward if they weren't in agreement there. And Mary was held in admiration by all the people of Israel. And when she was 3 years old, she walked with a step so mature, she spoke so perfectly, and spent her time so assiduously in the praises of God, that all were astonished at her, and wondered, and she was not reckoned a young infant, but as it were a grown-up person of 30 years old. I clearly have not spent all that much time with children, so I'm going to assume here, because I don't know offhand when kids start walking at 3 to be walking like a mature adult, which I assume means walking straight and not walking with back pain. That was a joke. Anyway, so this is very unusual, I believe, for a 3-year-old to be doing these things. What, you have other things to do? We have a deal, Gingersnap. I fed you early for this. Anyway, so Mary was so constant in prayer, and her appearance was so beautiful and glorious that scarcely anyone could look into her face. We've had a few times where the gospel, or the Bible in general, feels it very necessary to tell us that women are beautiful over and over, and in the case of Judith, anyway. So, by the way, this is where the story is going to start maybe surprising you. And she occupied herself constantly with her wool work, so that she in her tender years could do all that old women were not able to do. I learned how to knit when I was 8. I cannot imagine a 3-year-old weaving. I don't. Anyway, that's definitely unusual. Even I know that. And this was the order that she had set for herself. 3 years old. Again, she's 3 years old. From the morning to the 3rd hour, she remained in prayer. From the 3rd to the 9th, she was occupied with weaving, and from the 9th, she again applied herself to prayer. She did not retire from praying until there appeared to her the angel of the Lord, from whose hand she used to receive food. And thus she became more and more perfect in the work of God. So she prays and weaves and prays all day, does not stop to eat, until an angel comes and brings her dinner, which is wild. So then, when the older virgins rested from the praises of God, she did not rest at all, so that in the praises and vigils of God none were found before her, no one more learned in the wisdom of the law of God, more lowly in humility, more elegant in singing, more perfect in all virtue. She was indeed steadfast, immovable, unchangeable, and daily advancing to perfection. No one saw her angry, nor heard her speaking evil. All her speech was so full of grace that her God was acknowledged to be in her tongue. She was always engaged in prayer and searching the law, and she was anxious lest any word of hers she should sin with regard to her companions. Then she was afraid lest in her laughter or the sound of her beautiful voice she should commit any fault, or lest, being elated, she should display any wrongdoing or haughtiness to one of her equals. So she's always very conscious of what she is saying and how she is talking and how she's treating people. She blessed God without intermission. I know that just means without stopping, but she blessed God without intermission is really, I like that as a theater person. And lest perchance even in her salutation she might cease from praising God. If anyone saluted her, she used to answer by way of salutation, "Thanks be to God." And from her the custom first began of men saying, "Thanks be to God," when they saluted each other. She refreshed herself only with the food which she daily received from the hand of the angel, but the food which she obtained from the priests she divided among the poor. The angels of God were often seen speaking with her, and they most diligently obeyed her. If any one who was unwell touched her, the same hour he went home cured. So that is from the Gospels of James and Pseudo-Matthew. So this is really, Mary has a very exciting and storied and angelic youth. That any food that the priests give her, she gives to the poor, and she only eats what angels give her, which, wow, that's pretty impressive. And so she basically is perfect. Basically, that she's always thoughtful and giving to others and just excelling in everything, which is just absolutely extraordinary. So that was from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. James has Mary grew up with not quite as many angels, but she's still like super accomplished and helps create hangings for the temple. And she's weaving the scarlet in one scene. So that's interesting. There's not quite as many angels, but the emphasis on Mary being as like literally perfect as possible is really interesting. So with these stories, I want to get into a pet peeve of mine. Most often comes up in December, and like I know there are maybe more other more important things in the world that I should focus on more, but this one just It annoys me, and it's always going to be there. So the Immaculate Conception is not the same thing as the virgin birth. So the Immaculate Conception refers to the conception of Mary herself, and the virgin birth refers to the conception and birth of Jesus. So different generations. So the Immaculate Conception is how Anne and Joachim came to have Mary. So Immaculate Conception is literally one of like the newest official doctrines in the Catholic Church. It was 1854. 1854. So any church named Immaculate Conception is going to be on the newer side of things. It's a fun fact. I hope that I don't accidentally get very disrespectful here, because again, I'm not a Catholic, and I'm not from a tradition that really reveres Mary in these ways. So this is unusual from my perspective. So Jesus is born of a human, and Jesus is God, and humans are we're kind of terrible, honestly. I mean, have you met humans? So like, could Jesus be born from somebody with original sin? So original sin is a doctrine from the 4th century. So it isn't really even around by the time James is being written, or like any of the Gospels that we accept. So original sin is, so like even just an infant, like 1 second old, is already bearing original sin. Augustine writes that it is given through sperm. So it's just, original sin is it's absolutely inherent to who we are as human beings, and there's no getting around it. We have original sin, even though God's grace can overcome that, and the love of Jesus can forgive us. We are in our very nature sinners, because we are humans. Original sin is more of a Catholic thing than a Protestant thing. So again, also not something that I am as familiar with, because it is not from the tradition that I was trained in. So the Immaculate Conception means that Mary was conceived without original sin, so that Jesus had an extra, like, special, holy, unusual, unique vessel to be born from. And that is very important if you... So again, these other Gospels, we've been telling stories about Jesus for 2,000 years. We're still not entirely sure we've got it right. We probably don't. I like to think we've got at least, large chunks of it right, but the idea of someone being both human and divine is really hard to balance at all. And so this idea of Jesus needing to be born from somebody without original sin is really more focusing on his divine aspects, and really just like elevating that. But at the same time, he's human, and so it's complicated. I don't know. I don't know. This is not the point of Christian doctrine that I personally feel the most invested in. So are Anne and Joachim real people? They could be. I don't know. They're not mentioned anywhere in the Bible that we do have. I don't know, maybe. Would this change what I believe if it turned out that the Immaculate Conception is like a legit thing? Probably not. Anyway, so could Jesus be born from someone with original sin? ? Or is it even possible for a human to be good enough to bear or to raise Jesus? Probably not. I mean, there's no comparing to Jesus. But if you have someone like the Mary of these stories, who is like literally perfect, and like hangs out with angels all the time, and was raised in a temple, and like was born without original sin, like maybe she gets closer to being good enough than anyone else in all of humanity. So the first celebration for the feast day of Mary's conception was in the 7th century in the Eastern Church, and it came to England in the 11th century. It's December 8th, if you were wondering. It's coming up pretty soon. Yeah, so it's just really interesting. We keep trying to figure out who is Jesus, how is Jesus, and keep trying to find these ways to explain the unexplainable. Honestly, it is unexplainable. So these are really interesting stories that very much still have... You want to come back up? Or just want to sit there and yell at me? Cats. Yes, these stories still have some pretty deep religious and cultural significance for a lot of people around the world. And so this is part of the Jesus narrative in some traditions. So I wanted to end at the Mary being in the temple as a child. We will return to these Gospels next week with some more stories of Mary later on, and how Joseph comes into the picture, which is a really interesting story. All of these are just super... I mean, it's kind of hard to beat the infancy gospel of Thomas we had last week with Jesus killing his friends and bringing them back to life, and then the clay sparrows breathing life into them like God at creation. Anyway, it's kind of hard to beat that level of very interesting extra gospel, but these are really interesting stories, and whether or not they are historically accurate, I just think it's really cool that we as humans have been trying just so hard to understand God and the nature of Jesus for so long. So, friends, this week is Thanksgiving, or as I celebrate, Pancakesgiving, on Thursday. So we won't be doing our usual Zoom fellowship at 5. But I do hope to see some of you on Sunday morning at 10 in person in the sanctuary, or at about 10:15 for the live stream. It will be the first Sunday of Advent, so we'll have some special music and begin the celebration of Advent, which is the lead up to Christmas, preparing for a child and for the coming of God into the world. Advent is one of my favorite liturgical seasons, and I think it's really lovely. So anyway, I hope you'll join us for that. As you may know, daily infection numbers in Michigan are literally the worst that they have ever been at any point throughout the pandemic. So if you are traveling for the holidays, I do hope that you are safe and mask up and are safe. It's strange and difficult times that we live in. And hope we see an end to them someday. So anyway, in the meanwhile, good night and happy Thanksgiving from us. Until next time.